Hi everyone. Today is the 13th of January 2018 in New Zealand. For those of you who don't know who I am and why I'm debunking myths around childbirth, I'm the director for Common Knowledge Trust. We're a registered tax-exempt charitable trust in New Zealand, but my accent is from America. And in the early 1970s, I happened to be privileged to work with hundreds of ordinary men and women who, by some sheer quirk of fate, developed what is now known as Birthing Better Childbirth Preparation. So I experienced this shift from earlier trends in childbirth to the ones there are now. So when I gave birth in 1970, there were no doulas. In fact, in the United States, there were no midwives. There were lay midwives and Vietnam paramedics that were doing births, and some obstetricians and some GPs. That's unlike some other developed countries like the Netherlands and the UK and other countries where midwives were integrated into the system, both in the hospital as staff and at home births. So there were no doulas, and the role of fathers in the early 70s, from the 60s to the 70s, was that they were birth coaches. Lamaze was heavily towards fathers being a birth coach, and the Bradley method was a husband coach birth coach system. And in New Zealand, there was Grantley Dick Reed, and when the early study in 1960 was done about the benefits of women using skills in childbirth, at that point fathers weren't permitted into the birth. And so there was a trained birth coach at that point. So why did doulas develop in the United States? Because that's really where they developed first, and in California. So I happen to be, part of this conversation because that you couldn't help but be part of the conversation of the changes in childbirth, particularly if you were of childbearing age, which I was. So doulas developed first because home birth midwives were continuity of care. That meant that they attended a woman in pregnancy, in birth, and after birth, but it also meant that they saw their role, and women saw their roles, as being with them when they wanted them with them. And they saw that as a differentiation between the care that they would get from obstetricians and what they would do about going to the hospital. So in the early 1970s, you were advised to go to the hospital when your contractions were 3 minutes apart and a minute long. And so what happened was that midwives who believed in this continuity of care model were saying, no, I'll come when you want me to be there, which meant that if the labor was a 4 or 5 hour labor or an 8 hour labor or a 10 or 12 hour labor, that was fairly reasonable. But when it got on to 15 hours and 24 hours and 36 hours and beyond that, midwives who were generous in their time and energy, but they had families, then were committed to that extent of time. And they tended to arrive at births very early. So the message that we were given was go to the hospital when your contractions are 3 minutes apart and a minute long. But midwives were called when the contractions were further apart and shorter because the woman was in labor. And already people were giving over their sense of responsibility to midwives who were saying that they had some sort of cosmic knowledge. And so women began to depend on midwives very, very early. And we could see that because we could see the change in behaviors. So if women and men stayed at home and then went to the hospital, they were already well into their labor and were doing whatever they were doing. If they were using skills, they were already using their skills. But when midwives started to give continuity of care, we saw men and women be skilled until the midwife arrived, and the midwives arrived often very early. So doulas started to develop because midwives were exhausted. They have families. So the idea was that the doula would become the birth coach and then call the midwife once labor was more advanced. The other reason that doulas became so popular was that the role of fathers began to change. So when I gave birth in 1970, fathers were the birth coach. And then the natural birth movement began to say, we don't want fathers to be on the sideline telling women, push, 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 push. And when I gave birth the last time in 1982, the role of fathers was to be a support and not to coach. So that left a void. And what that void filled with was doulas. But why I'm debunking the myth about this is not because I happen to have these beliefs. It's because the families I worked with saw this change. And this was part of why Birthing Better skills developed. Because what we were doing was layering on top of ourselves another group of professionals. So this was not as true in the hospitals in the United States at that point. You went in, there was staff, they'd change after 8 hours, and you'd have an obstetrician that would come in periodically, and you were left alone. So Lamaze and the Bradley method worked very well where you were dependent on yourselves. In home births, where midwives in continuity of care were coming very much earlier, you stopped depending on yourselves. And when the role of the father shifted from being a birth coach to a birth support, and fathers were told, you're not supposed to tell women what to do, and your role is to protect this space in some way and support women's choices in some ways, then what happened is that gap became very big. Who was in fact being the birth coach? It was either the midwife, who was then required to do that with every one of her clients, which is exhausting if you have to make a living going to births. For anybody who wants to be a midwife, you have to, unless you're charging an arm and a leg, in order to make a living. And think about it, if you're doing 20 births a year and you're charging $4,000, you're making $80,000, but you're running a business. So everything has to be subtracted off that. In New Zealand, where you have community midwives they're paid by the government, they have to do between 40 and 80 births a year in order to make a living, because every expense is coming out of their pocket. So doulas filled this gap. And then it also was compounded by the fact that people were saying, women know about birth, and so therefore you want another woman to support you. But this is another myth about childbirth. There are lots of people who believe that women who work as midwives know how to birth. Well, they don't. If you ask midwives, well, how was your birth? They really are in two categories, because I've asked tens and thousands of them around the world. They either have had great births and they want everybody to have a great birth, and so therefore they go into midwifery because they had a great birth and want to be at birth, or they had a miserable birth and they don't want anybody else to have a miserable birth, so they go into midwifery because they don't want they hope to help and improve childbirth. So, or because it is a profession in which people go into it for passion. So doulas often become doulas because they want to be around pregnant women, they want to be around babies, they want to be around birth, but they don't want to take on the responsibility. But doulas haven't birthed any better than the general population either. They've often had either good births or poor births, and they have a passion about pregnancy and being around birth and being around babies. And this is, in one way, it's been great because there's now a rise of the postnatal doula, postpartum doulas, people who will help you with the birth. And that's where modern people really lack, is family help after the birth. But for birth, because the role of the father shifted in the 70s from coach to support, then men were basically told, you're just going to hang out there. But that was compounded by the fact that these three wonderful male obstetricians, Grantley, Dick Reed, Lamaze, and Bradley, who developed the first universal systems of skills around childbirth, only focused those skills for people who wanted a less medical, a pain-free labor, and a natural birth. And that was the sort of the fatal flaw in the system to begin with, because giving birth is always an activity, and you have to do it. And Birthing Better families, when we evolved the skills in the 1970s, evolved them because there were so many gaps in the Lamaze and the Bradley method. And people were saying, how do we fill this gap? Is there a skill we can use? Could I have used a skill? Those breathing techniques didn't work. So how do I breathe? Or doing this or doing that, or what do I do about pain in my hip or pain in my back, or what do I do if I have negative thoughts in my head, or what do I do with really quick labors or long labors or niggling labors. So we developed skills around this. We understood that every family is saying, I want to have the most empowered, positive birth possible. How do I do that? And women want their baby's father or other to be the primary person to help them. They don't want them just standing around. So fathers develop these skills equally with women. So what we found in the early 1970s was we had to give this message. You are doing an activity, you need to be skilled. Everybody there needs to be skilled to help you stay in control and be on top of what you internally feel and what happens to and around you. If we had grown in that manner, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't be talking about debunking the myths around childbirth, because the myths around childbirth developed because the messages were skewed from the start. One is that skills were only attributable to people who wanted natural, normal births and pain-free labors, which so few women achieved, or that you could just plan your birth. Women know what they want, and so forth. Write a birth plan about what you want and don't want, and then expect everybody to give that to you. That wasn't going to work either. So we're now at a new evolution, a new trend that has to arise. And we believe that that trend is based on everybody becoming skilled and knowing how to work through this activity of giving birth, whether it's a normal birth at home, whether it's a medical birth in the hospital, whether it's a non-laboring cesarean. It's your baby's birth. Be skilled to birth your baby and know how to prepare your pregnant body to give birth, because every pregnant body is preparing in the same way hormonally to labor and have a vaginal birth. Your mind knows if you're not going to, but this is your baby's birth, so do it because it's infrequent, and create this cultural way of preparing for the birth of your baby. If you want a doula, that's absolutely fine, but primarily you need to be skilled to birth your baby, and you need to prepare your body to birth your baby. And secondarily, as in the same primary equality, different role, different tasks, but skills, is you need your primary person, your husband, your partner, your best friend, your mother, whoever is going to be there, to be an effective birth coach. And the two of you need to share a common set of skills. That's what's so important, and that's why Birthing Better is housed in a charitable trust called Common Knowledge, because we all blink, we all cough, we can all tighten up our rectum. Humans only breathe 4 ways. We have variations, but based on those 4 ways, we can all find the best way to breathe. We can all tighten up our rectum. Don't tighten up your rectum if you're having a vaginal birth. Always keep your rectum soft and relaxed. And your partner, because he can't see that or she can't see that, needs to have a non-verbal or verbal communication with you, skills to help you remind yourself not to do that. You can have a doula who's highly skilled, but do not replace your significant partner with a doula. Just add to the team of skilled people. So, what's the role of a doula? Great, if you want another person there and you want to hire a doula, they're willing to give their services for free, wonderful. However, do not be caught in this belief that fathers or others should not be your birth coach. They need to be. They are going to be the father or the closest person to this child. If you remove them from being skilled during pregnancy or skilled during the birth of your baby, they will not have the confidence to be skilled with your newborn, and you'll push them out of the way, and that breeds resentment. Now, just as a pitch, I've been developing fathers to be pregnancy academies in Udemy, and mothers to be pregnancy and academies in Udemy as well. They're based on the 10 skills that fathers said we need to develop from conception to birth, because they were often left behind by the rapid changes in you during pregnancy and the rapid changes of your baby. So what fathers discovered, Birthing Better fathers discovered, is that pregnancy is divided into 5 phases. conception to 12 weeks, 12 weeks to 24, 24 to 36, 36 to birth and the birth. For anybody who thinks that birth is separate, you are pregnant until your baby is born. You have to understand that. So fathers develop these 10 skills to develop in these phases, how they were applied to the baby's mother, and to themselves. And those skills morph. So far, we have a Fathers-to-Be Pregnancy Academy conception to 12 weeks, 12 weeks to 24, and 24 to 36 weeks, and a Mothers-to-Be Pregnancy Academy conception to 12 weeks and 12 weeks to 24 weeks. And on the 13th of January 2018, I am working on the Mothers-to-Be Pregnancy Academy 24 to 36 weeks, which should be launched in Udemy in the next 2 weeks. So what we're saying is Birthing Better Families, what we're saying to you as a common knowledge trust is that we want to bring forward a new evolution in childbirth with a concept that all mothers and fathers-to-be need to become skilled to birth their babies and then use skills to birth their babies no matter where that is, where they birth, who is present, whether it's a doula or not, and no matter what happens to or around them. We need you to pass on this message. It's a simple message. We need to marry skills and choice, and yet we need to understand that if you don't have choices, you still have skills. If your choices change, you still have skills. Skills should become fundamental in our societal thinking about childbirth because it is always an activity, period. So it's great that there are doulas. It's great that more people are at births. It's great that there are postnatal doulas around that are helping young families with young babies. It's wonderful that they are there. However, we should not mistake the role of a doula as somebody who knows about birth because they don't know any more than you do, no matter how much they've studied. It's your birth, nor that they should be your primary coach. Your partner should be your primary coach, and you should be skilled, and you should bring them in as part of your team, not to replace a member of your team. So I made it under 20 minutes this time. I'm traveling tomorrow. I don't think that I'm going to be able to do an early live on Facebook. I may be doing one a little bit later, and I'll continue to debunk the myths. And after this very long and extensive comments about the confused conversation we have in childbirth that women are passing on to women, that's creating craziness, really. The extent of shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger around childbirth has just gone like this since I gave birth in 1970. And it is because we didn't grow a skilled birthing population when we had a moment of opportunity, and that got squashed and replaced by the choice-based trend we have now. So after this series, I am going to do a series on the truths around childbirth, because the truths are much simpler. And once we understand the truths around childbirth, then we will get on with growing a skilled birthing population for everyone. And our trust relies on you to pass on these videos. It relies on you to purchase Birthing Better resources and become skilled, or give it as a gift. It relies on you to pass on the simple message: everyone should become skilled to birth their baby, no matter the type of birth they have. So thank you for being part of the conversation. If you have any comments, please leave them on this video post. Start a conversation. We want to make certain that families understand how easy it is to skillfully birth their baby, no matter where or how or who is with them. So bye-bye, guys.